Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Great, okay, thank you. And those of you online, thank you very much for joining us. Any issues hearing us or being able to see, then obviously just post something in the chat and we can sort that out. But hopefully this is all working okay for you. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is a Legal Voices for the Future knowledge session. Legal Voices, just to introduce us for those who don't know, we're an independent knowledge sharing forum, and we're established by and run for junior practitioners and law students from all different fields of law. We run monthly knowledge sessions like this one, and also member-only webinars on various topics on the intersection of law and the environment. So we're very excited to have one of our members, Clara, with us here today. She is going to be hosting tonight's session on AI, environment and the law. And she's accompanied by a really fantastic panel lineup, so we hope you all enjoy. We'll be sharing a Slido link for the panel Q&A in the meeting chat, and there's also a code for this on the slides on the bottom right. So it would be fantastic if you could put your questions into the Slido. Or otherwise just raise your hand in the room and ask them in person, that's fine. The session is being recorded and also photographed. If you would prefer not to be in any of the photos, just let one of the Legal Voices team down the front here know. And finally, you might have noticed some QR codes dotted around the room. This is for our members' survey. And this is really important for us to gather your feedback and get your ideas on what we could do in the future with LVF and how we can improve our offering. So we'd be really grateful if you could spare, should take you less than 10 minutes to scan the code and fill the survey out. That would be really great. Thank you so much. But now I will hand over to Clara to introduce today's knowledge session, and I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's so great to see so many of you here. I saw there was a lot of sign-ups, but I was told half of the people would drop out, and it's normal, but it seems like a lot of you have shown up, which is amazing. So this session is going to start off with a creative portion. So we're going to be having a look at two pieces of artwork. And what's going to happen is you guys will go into some groups. This is not really formal, just see the people that you like the look of and go next to them. And there's some facilitators dotted around the room. So if you're a facilitator, please could you raise your hand so people know who you are? Amazing. So if you could just group around these facilitators, I'm going to ask you to have a look at the pieces of art. And one of them is generated by AI, and one of them is not. And if you could just have a guess on which one is generated by AI, and maybe even say which one you prefer and why. I really just wanted to start the session with a discussion on the role of technology in art. Do you think that we need humans to create art? How do you feel about the idea of AI making art, music, poetry? And what is art, really? What makes art art? And your facilitators also have a bit of background about these pieces of art so they can fill you in. But really, go crazy, explore this idea of technology in art and how this makes you feel. It's not directly related to the topic of this session, which is AI, the environment, and the law, but it's something that is very popular in all of these sessions, the creative content part, because it gets everyone a bit excited and talkative. So please get into groups when you're ready and have a discussion about art. It's going to be about 30 minutes, isn't it? Yes. Okay, everyone, we have run out of time now. So please could you close up your discussions, and we've got a couple of roaming mics, so some people are going to come around and please share your thoughts and your group's ideas about how you feel about AI and the world of art. So should we start maybe over here? Yeah. Oh, sorry, let me just start by clarifying for those of you who don't know which is which. So the image with the big circle in the middle is the one that's created by AI. And the other one is not. It's a mixture of CGI, so that's like a lot of kind of like Photoshop. It takes a lot of hours and you have to edit things, but it's also an actual person, an actual costume, and a mix of technology and human work mixed together, but no AI. Okay, please, please share your discussions.
Okay, our group thought it was the one on the right, and they were right. And some emotions were that the one on the left made somebody feel bereft. Somebody liked the one on the right because it made them think about sci-fi. We discussed whether it's good, whether it's a bad thing that it's created by AI or not, whether it matters, and what the human element is, and whether there's skill involved. We talked about AI replacing jobs and whether that was a good thing. Mixed feelings on that and what jobs it might replace. Anyone else? What else did we talk about? I'm forgetting.
Thank you. Thank you.
We talked about kind of similar stuff to you guys. Additionally, we had a conversation about whether or not we should be using AI for things like this when it does have an environmental impact. So when you're producing these images, it's going to generate carbon emissions. And we kind of went back and forth on that. I think you can imagine a world where creation of this art in an AI form could have a lesser environmental impact than the actual production of the art in real life. For example, if you had a Hollywood movie that was produced using just AI, if you just typed a prompt into a video AI generator and it produced a whole Hollywood movie, that would probably have a lesser environmental impact than a whole Hollywood production, for example. But then you get into the question about, labor rights and how many jobs that would lose. I think another point actually is in terms of who benefits from the creation of the art. When it comes to AI-generated art, it's going to be the tech companies, it's going to be OpenAI, Meta, and so on. Whereas, when it's human-generated, it's the artist, and the kind of ethical dimension around that.
Thanks. A lot of people in our group actually thought the one on the left was created by AI, and that prompted a discussion of what is actually generated by AI, because the one on the right, if I recall correctly, had the author put in 600 lines of text just to manipulate the image, so there was some human input to that, and that led to a discussion of what actually constitutes AI artwork. How do we actually understand who creates what? Because at the end of the day, it's an amalgamation of data that's in the internet or sources like that. And, that led to discussions of things like copyright, who owns that. It's a big gray zone. So lots of interesting questions and uncertainties arise.
We discussed some similar issues to that as well. I think the bottom line was the question of AI and art raising a lot of question marks, and questions that we probably can't quite answer at this point. But we talked about, in terms of what makes art, the manual effort that goes into producing something, but also the proximity of the link between the effort that someone makes and the output. We also had people saying that, but actually it's more about the output itself. So what is produced at the end, that's what makes the art, and the process isn't maybe the deciding factor. And we had a few points made about what does this do to competition. So for the second image, for example, the artwork that won a prize, actually, and what would that have done to human competitors who did not use AI in that case? So competition, but also the situation of artists and making sure that they're not exploited by new technologies, that they get their dues, that they have the correct rights to their work and ownership of their work as well. So a lot of change and a lot of questions all around, basically. Thanks.
So yeah, we had mixed reviews on whether we thought that left or right was the AI generated piece. But yeah, I think in the end we discussed the kind of like futuristic nature of the piece on the right hand side, kind of led it towards being the AI generated one. In terms of our discussions, we also had similar conversations about copyright. And the kind of conversations about what makes art art. Is it the output or is it the process that goes into it? I think one point that Vanessa made, which was quite good, was in relation to the output, the difference between creating sort of poetry and the sort of language versus creating an image. When you're creating something that involves a lot of language, it can kind of come straight from the heart, really. So when you're using that as AI, deriving from AI, is that quite different in terms of artwork compared to coming from an actual human?
Yeah, a few of us actually thought there was one on the left was AI generated, but the majority thought the one on the right was. They claimed that there were some indicators as to why it was AI generated, the futuristic nature of it, the level of detail, and we also discussed what that means for competitions and whether perhaps AI generated content is on a different playing field, and perhaps that should be disclosed, and there should be slightly different competitions or different categories within competitions to account for the mediums that are used to generate those images. We also discussed what it means for other sort of creative content, including legal content that is, in a way, could be created or is at least a demonstration of human ingenuity in many ways. And we thought, well, that just cast doubts on what it means to be ingenuous and what it means to be artistic when you're using a tool that helps you represent what you aim without perhaps doing it yourself manually. And yeah, we just had some conversations about how that makes it feel, and I think most of us are on two minds as to whether we like AI generated art or not so much.
Last group.
One of the, I think, interesting points was made over here. We discussed how walking around a museum, you feel connection when you're looking at a piece of art because of what you see alongside it. So a description of who drew it or the efforts that gone into it. And one of the thoughts was, well, if you walked around and at the end you were told, actually, this is all generated by AI, how that would make you feel. And the group thought that would make us feel not very positive about AI. And I think overall, we were quite negative about AI art. That led to a discussion about why it does matter, that it's drawn by a person or created by a human. And I think we drilled down to the idea that it's about appreciating the human talent. And so that's where there was quite a lot of fear, I think, about AI taking that away. Thank you.
Incredible. Thank you so much, everyone. For those of you online, and if you would like to share your thoughts, please can you unmute yourself and share them now? We still have a couple of minutes. Either people are shy or the technology issues have continued. We had basically every problem you could think of before starting. So we'll just move on. Thank you so much. That was incredible. You guys came up with stuff I hadn't even thought of, and I sent the facilitators a really lengthy email with anything I thought could be discussed, and you guys covered things that went on there. So thank you for that. Please make your way back to your seats, and we'll start with the next part of the session, which is an introductory talk to the themes by me. Then we'll move on to the panel discussion.
On standby with the roving lights. Great. If you need anything on the presentations, I'll be right back.
Okay, thank you.
Did you know which one was the AI one. Yeah, I guess you would have known about the competition.
Only because I knew about the competition.
Yeah. I didn't know that was the one, but I was there's like this one that won this competition, and I remember it looking really nice.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? But then I also think that if you look nowadays, you can get photorealistic drawings, for example, which look like photographs, versus then, prompt-based artwork, which, you can get hyper-realistic stuff nowadays, right? So I think the question, we ended up having a lot of debate and discussion around sort of what is creativity? What does creativity actually mean? Like, somebody had to know what they were looking for to prompt that multiple times to get it into shapes. So there's a degree of creativity there. The literacy requirements that are, in a prompt or in a series of prompts that are actually there, and it's a substantive set. Is that creativity? That's an interesting take on there. One of the group actually talked about photography, right? And I remember being at the Wildlife Photographer of the Year Award, and it's only like 8 or 9 years ago that they started allowing SLRs in, because they said that wasn't artistic, right? And they said that actually the camera lenses were too strong, that it didn't have any of the artistic qualities. So I think it was an interesting point made by another group, I think.
Thank you, everyone. I'll just wait for people to get back to their seats. But
is this a bit of a question about transparency?
There was just one last thing for that creative portion that I wanted to share. And it's a quote by my uni housemate's lock screen for 4 years, Nicolas Cage. He had an award, he won an award at a film awards show on Sunday, and he actually mentioned the idea of AI and art. So he said, "I am a big believer in not letting robots dream for us. Robots cannot reflect the human condition for us. If an actor lets one AI robot manipulate his or her performance even a little bit, all integrity, purity, and truth of art will be replaced by financial interests only," which touches on what a couple of groups already mentioned, which is great. So, we've done that. So, to begin the introductory part, as I mentioned, I'll be giving an introduction to the main themes of this session before we move on to the panelists. And I'll be talking about AI and the environment, but unlike a lot of the previous sessions that Legal Voices for the Future hosts every month, if you guys have been here before, I won't be touching on the law part so much because I'm not a qualified lawyer yet. If you've been through the training contract application process, you'll understand the pain. So I won't go into that. I'll leave that to our panel of experts, and I'll just focus on the AI and the environment part. And before I start, I'll just introduce you to our star-studded panel. Let's start with Alex over there. So Alex Crivaro is the director of HSF's Emerging Technology Group. He leads a global team of lawyers across practices, sectors, and regions to help clients navigate legal and regulatory change. Alex is an advocate of digital change and advises a wide range of businesses, from innovative startups to multinational corporations. And he advises them on AI as well as other novel tech. He is an active member of the emerging technology community, a regular speaker at high-profile events, not unlike this one, and widely published on AI and emerging tech. He has been named a next-generation partner for FinTech and holds an individual ranking for FinTech in Chambers 2025. And last week, he was also listed on the Lawyers Hot 100 2025. Congrats, Alex. Then we have Mika Morissette. Mika is a senior associate here at HSF. She specializes in environmental, social, and governance, or ESG. She advises clients on matters relating to ESG-related regulation, soft law standards, and voluntary compliance frameworks, as well as market disclosure and reporting. She also helps clients with ESG-related risk management, stakeholder engagement, and corporate sustainability strategy, and she frequently advises on ESG issues in the context of transactions. And before moving to focus on ESG, Mika also specialized in energy and infrastructure, finance and project development, with a focus on renewable projects, including in emerging markets. And that is a lot, so congratulations to you too. Bruna Trevelyan, our final panelist here, is legal counsel at Hugging Face, which is a leading open and collaborative AI development platform. Here, Bruna navigates the intersection of technology and law. She's a dual qualified lawyer with a strong background in AI, intellectual property, privacy, and competition law. She's driven by a passion for exploring the complex relationship between technology, law, and society. And last year, she also co-authored a primer on the topic of this panel, the environmental impact of AI. So I used a lot of her content to form the presentation I'm about to give, unless it was incorrect, and then that's my fault, that's not from there. And I pass this on to Legal Voices for the Future, so they'll be circulating their first newsletter, and this will be the recommended reading if you want to learn more. Right. As any good lawyer does, which I will be very soon, we start with the definitions of key terms. So, starting with AI. Now, we probably won't use all of these words in the session, but I think it's useful to know. The bonus ones with the star, you kind of need to know to define the main ones, which I think you will need to use. And I think it's just useful to know them in life because often these terms can be confused with one another, and in the news, they mention these terms that it's not immediately obvious what they mean. So let's start with AI, artificial intelligence. It's a very broad term, and it encompasses a variety of technology and different techniques, but essentially it's describing a computer which can mimic human behavior. So it can identify patterns, make complex decisions, create, solve complex problems. And then we move on to machine learning. This is a subset of AI. It uses algorithms or sets of instructions to detect patterns in large data sets, allowing computers to learn and adapt even without being told to do so each time. So for example, you might be familiar with Instagram algorithms. So they use machine learning to determine what content appears on your feed, your reels, your stories. What it's doing is it's choosing posts based on patterns of your behavior, what you're liking, what your friends are liking, who you tend to stalk, who you're messaging a lot, and what they're doing. And then it recommends content to you that they think will keep you on the app for the longest amount of time, really, and that will engage you. The bonus term here is neural networks. I really didn't want to define this because I don't think it has a very exciting name, but it is actually quite important. It's a type of machine learning algorithm that is inspired by the human brain. So you can see the little diagram at the bottom there. It consists, like the human brain, of interconnecting nodes and multiple layers. So neurons will receive input or information, process it, and then send the output to other neurons. And over time, after lots of training and being told what's right and what's wrong, connections between certain neurons will become stronger and stronger, so it will know what the right answer is. And it will allow these neural networks to solve complex problems. So a good example of this is image recognition. You can submit an image, it will process it, think about, it will connect to the neurons which have seen other similar images and then detect, oh, that's a picture of a dog. Similarly with handwriting recognition, you might write something on your iPad in handwriting, and then the neural networks will help identify that you've written the letter C and written the letter D. So moving on down to the one in pink, deep learning. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning. It uses neural networks with lots of layers, so deep neural networks, to automatically extract key features from large amounts of data and make complex decisions. So this is where you see things like facial recognition in photos. This is a result of deep learning where the system can identify features like eyes and noses and mouths to not just tell you it's a picture of a dog, but tell you it's a picture of your aunt Edna because she's got this specific type of nose shape. And then we have generative AI. So this is a subset of deep learning. It refers to AI systems that also learn from large sets of data, but this time its aim is to create new content. So it's creating new text, it's creating artwork like the one that we saw, music. And it uses patterns from data to create this new content. It also operates from things called prompts or natural language requests from a user for the generative AI to perform a specific task. So this is where you'll see things like Siri, Alexa, ChatGPT, Copilot. You say to it what you want, and then it'll generate that outcome. And I just want to apologize to my mum online, because when I told her about the panel event, she said, please, can you just make it not boring? And I did my best, but it's a lot of technical terms and there's only so much I can do. You'll be happy to know, we'll move on to the next slide. If you retain even some of that, it's good, and I think it will help, but no stress. So our focus is going to be generative AI. There was another bonus term which I'll define shortly, but I just wanted to say that when I talk about AI, and even the name of this panel, what I think came to most of your minds will have been generative AI. It's what initially got me excited about the topic of AI. I loved experimenting with ChatGPT and getting amazed at how quickly it processed huge amounts of data and generated text in natural language that was understandable and very comprehensive. Yes, sorry. But this is also what has led to the increase of data centers being built around the world, which are causing huge amounts of pollution, and we'll touch on that in my presentation and with the panel as well. And here I wanted to define large language models. I think most of you would have heard this because it's a key part of how generative AI creates and understands text. So it uses machine learning and other techniques to understand and generate human language. It's trained on vast amounts of data, often 1 billion words or billions of words, and then uses neural networks to learn patterns and rules of language. So then it can answer questions, translate, summarize text, and so on. And then environment and the law. I won't define these terms technically. Also, bonus points if you can guess which images are from Guernsey, my home. But I wanted to say that in this session, I really don't want to lose focus or touch with what brings us all together in this room for these monthly knowledge sessions. And that's our want to use the law to protect the environment, the air, the land, the sea, ecosystems, anything naturally occurring, from harms like climate change, from pollution, from biodiversity loss. And although the distinguishing part of this knowledge session is AI, the purpose of the session is really to understand and raise awareness of how AI interacts with the environment and how the law comes into play in that relationship. And that brings us on to motivation and objectives. So why this session? As I said, I really love experimenting with ChatGPT. You can ask it to make your own personalized gym plan, write your friends' birthday cards, like a lot of people who like using it. So as I was having fun, just typing away all sorts of random, also serious questions, then I saw some of these articles pop up saying, can the climate survive the insatiable energy demands of the AI arms race? And I was like, what? It turns out there is a stark reality to using these kind of magic tools, and that's the environmental cost. So I wanted to explore this in the session. And so the objectives are really to understand AI's dual impact on the environment, because there are really harmful, environmentally harmful parts of AI, but AI can also be used to help us reach net zero and benefit the environment. So we'll touch on that as well. And then finally, to have a look at the role that law can play in maximizing the benefits of AI on the environment whilst minimizing the harms. So let's start with AI's detrimental impact on the environment. I thought a good place to start would be to understand AI's life cycle. So AI has a life cycle that includes data collection. So you need to gather all this data that AI needs to operate from various sources. So you can do this by web scraping, from sensors like information picked up from cameras, microphones, weather stations, and user interaction. So like I mentioned, your activity on social media is data, online shopping habits, and this data then has to be stored and processed in data centers. So I've mentioned those before, but basically big buildings with all the technology and hardware that you need to operate AI and store data. Then you have training. So training involves using powerful compute hardware, like microchips, and they process the collected data and then optimize AI. So tell it this is the right answer, not that, and then it shifts and learns from itself. Training is really intensive, and it can take weeks or even months for large models, and it's often cited as the most harmful part of the cycle on the environment. Then we have deployment. So once it's trained, it's out for people to use, for example, as chatbots, and they're continuously self-improving a lot of the time. So they still need those data centers and that technology support to keep it running and keep it going. And then finally, you have disposal. So with all of this technology, it's evolving so quickly, a lot of this hardware gets out of date and just needs to get disposed of, or it needs to be updated, but often disposed of. And that brings us on to environmental harms of AI. So these are the 5 main ones. At the top, you have energy. AI consumes a lot of energy. You need electricity to power the computers to collect data, to train models, and during deployment. In 2022, in Ireland, its data centers actually consumed more energy than all of the urban homes in 1 year. It's also good to note that AI's growing energy demand is outpacing renewable energy production, which is increasing our reliance on fossil fuels. So it needs so much energy, and there's just not enough energy produced by renewable systems. And so we're going back to fossil fuels here. Water availability as well. So just like when your laptop heats up when you use it too much, data centers do the same. So they need constant cooling. And a big way to do this is through using water. Basically, what they do is they have these radiators and they pump the water through the radiators around the data centers in the computer, and that absorbs the heat. And a hyperscale data center, which is a really big one, the kinds that Google and Microsoft use, consumes about 2.1 million liters of water a day. And some AI data centers are located in water-scarce regions like Arizona, which makes the situation even worse. And this is a thing that I didn't know until recently, but probably should have. But water scarcity is actually a really big problem around the world. And I guess it's because we're in the UK, you just turn the tap on and you don't have to think twice. But water scarcity or water availability is considered one of the most concerning aspects of climate change in most regions around the world. So this includes Africa, Europe, Asia, Central and South America. They all listed, when asked, what are you most concerned about climate change? They all listed water availability as one of their top 3 or top 4 choices. And a quarter of humanity already lacks access to clean water and sanitation. So it's not just a problem of whether you have water, it's whether that water is clean and usable, drinkable. Minerals. AI needs a lot of technology and microchips and hardware to operate. And these are made from mining materials like lithium, cobalt, and rare earth metals. Mining has a high carbon footprint, so extracting and refining minerals requires a lot of energy and produces CO2. It also often requires deforestation and ecosystem destruction because you need to build these mines, you need to transport the materials around. And they often are built and data centers are often also built wherever companies can find cheap water and electricity and lax environmental standards. So, apologies, I've just realized I think I've moved this to the wrong section, but it's still worth saying. Another interesting aspect of the environmental impact of AI is where the data centers are actually built. So they are chosen to be built in countries often where there are not very strong environmental protections so that they can destroy the environment with no problems, very cheap water, and very cheap electricity. And some academics have called this data colonialism because companies like Google, Microsoft, Meta, and OpenAI are already or looking at developing nations to locate their data centers. But we might touch on that later on in the panel. Back to mining, toxic waste and water pollution is also a big problem here. So heavy metals are often released from these mines. They pollute the rivers and groundwater. And human rights violations are also a concern here. So minerals like cobalt are called conflict minerals because they are mined and traded in areas of high conflict, like the Democratic Republic of Congo for cobalt. And so they contribute to worsening human rights abuses and armed conflict. And then we have greenhouse gas emissions as well. So the usage of water, Minerals and energy throughout the whole AI lifecycle, in particular with training and deployment, produces a lot of CO2. A single large language model can emit around 600,000 pounds of CO2, and this is equivalent to the emissions of 5 cars over their lifetime. And another major source is from the production of concrete and steel used in data centers. Another thing I didn't really know, but concrete has a really high carbon footprint. It's estimated to generate about 8% of all human CO2 emissions. And finally, electronic waste. So this isn't so much of a problem right now in terms of data centers and AI purely, but we suspect it's going to be a big problem in the future, we scientists. Data centers produce a lot of electronic waste at the end of their life cycle. Technology does need to be disposed of, as I mentioned, and this often releases toxic substances like mercury and lead into the environment. Okay, let's move on to slightly more positive things now. So how can AI help benefit the environment and potentially even help reach us net zero? When I first looked into this, I thought, okay, the first thought was we get the gift of time with AI, because net zero is such a time-pressured goal. For those of you who don't know, in 2021, the UK became the first major economy to set a legally binding target for net zero, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 100% to 1990 levels by 2050. So we're quite short on time, and we know that AI can be really, really efficient. And it can do that. It can help enhance our systems, enhance our energy usage. But I think it's important to know that as well as some people saying, yes, AI can be this magic tool to help us reach net zero, others are saying we have all we need. Like, we don't need any more. We have too much. We just need to stop burning fossil fuels. It's not that complicated. You might be doing more harm than you are doing good by saying that AI can help us. The discussion and debate goes a bit beyond this panel, but I think it's worth knowing that there are two schools of thought here. So, like I said, I wanted to go through some of the ways that AI can benefit the environment. So I thought a good way to structure this was just the sectors you can see here are the most polluting sectors right now in the world. So they're the most harmful sectors. And I wanted to show how, and give some examples of how AI can help benefit the environment in these sectors. So with energy, AI is being used to optimize energy consumption using smart grids. So in Canada, Mexico, Brazil, some EU member states, Japan, Korea, Australia, and China, these countries are either already using smart grids or they're investing in them. And what they do is they can analyze usage patterns. So they can tell you where in a country electricity, for example, is needed most, for what purpose, what times, and then in real time, it can send energy to that place. And it can also look at weather forecasts and tell you which renewable energy system you should use, solar or wind, for that particular time. Then we have agriculture. So similarly, AI technology like crop prediction models and soil sensors can help farmers optimize planting and irrigation. So it can monitor soil moisture and weather, and then apply water only when you need it. So it can save water resources and increase yield and food security. Then we have transport. In this sector, AI-powered traffic management systems can optimize traffic flow in cities and so reduce congestion and emissions. What I think is interesting about this is that Google has been a big part of this. So, Google Maps, you can choose the route which is the least energy intensive or the least consuming of fuel. And so they say that this can help save 1 million tons of carbon emissions per year if everyone just choose the more energy efficient route, which might be true. But it's a good example of AI's dual impact, because Google is obviously a very polluting company because of its data centers, but it's also investing in things like this. And then finally, we have manufacturing. AI can streamline production processes. For example, AI-powered predictive maintenance can prevent equipment failures and reduce energy waste, and then extend the lifespan of machinery too. So you don't have to keep building new machinery and mining for those materials. And there was a few more things that I wanted to touch on here as well, of how AI can help benefit the environment, or what we might need to keep in mind. And one of the things was AI evolution. So we know that AI is constantly evolving. There are already things like green AI models, like generative AI models, like ChatGPT, but that are only using sources of energy which are low and zero carbon. We've also seen DeepSeek in the news a lot this week, and last week as well. I just had a conversation with Alex about this, so he's going to go into that a bit in his part of his talk, or I might ask him a few questions about that. But DeepSeek has basically been called a revolutionary technology, and it uses a lot less energy, supposedly, and it's much cheaper to build, supposedly, than OpenAI's ChatGPT. And the reason I keep saying supposedly is there was a bit of controversy around whether it's sharing the right data, but some say that it uses a system called distillation to basically learn from another AI model rather than having to train itself from scratch. And that's why it's a lot less energy intensive, and that's why it's so revolutionary, because it doesn't have to cost so much to train it, and potentially even pollutes less. But we'll get into that as well. The second aspect is legislation and compliance in terms of AI tools can help in assisting to draft strong environmental laws, potentially. This is something that my dad is actually working on. He's a legal drafter in Guernsey, so he drafts the laws for the country. And he's part of a group of legislative drafters around the world who are currently experimenting with whether AI can draft strong laws, whether AI, like generative AI, can think of possible future scenarios that might happen that a human might not be able to, and then account for that and draft that into laws and make really, really strong environmental laws. AI can also feed into this by potentially helping us to monitor and enforce these laws. So it could, using drones and sensors on palm oil plantations, tell us whether those plantations are making a lot of damage, and in real time maybe even suggest strategies of how to suggest solutions to changing strategies to harm the environment less in those situations. Again, this is a really interesting topic, I think, but it goes a little bit beyond what we're going to be covering today. I think it's just good to be aware of. I also wanted to mention that what makes AI so exciting, I think, is that we don't know what it can do for us. It's already doing so much, but it can also offer so many more new things for your personal life, for your work. But it's also the scary part of it. I've touched on some environmental harms, but we really can't know. It's impossible to know how AI can harm the environment in the future, because we don't know how it's going to develop and how it's going to be used. And even at the moment, there's really little transparency and accountability that exists around this. So we don't know the full extent of the environmental harms at the moment. And that moves us on to the third theme, which, as I said, I'm not going to talk too much about, but I did want to say that the law is a powerful tool. It regulates how our societies work, and it often is a reflection of our values and our priorities in society. The law, as many of you know from these sessions, can be a really powerful tool as well to help catalyze the sustainability transition. And I think it's safe to say, even from me, a non-qualified lawyer, that effective use of law must be three things. Generally. First is holistic. We want to draw on different legal fields here to create effective law and use it, from international to corporate, and combine legal thinking with insights from other disciplines, for example, economics, physics, and finance. Especially in this kind of topic with AI and the environment, you need to look at and understand data science and climate science as well. It also needs to be global. So you need to think about general principles as well as the ones for specific countries and specific sets of rules for countries. Again, because AI and the environment, laws and impacts can transcend borders. A company like Google can be based in one country, but have data centers in another country and then serve people in all sorts of other countries. And finally, it needs to be practical. So academic thinking and the law ultimately needs to be informed by practice and geared towards effective action and what people will actually do and how governments will act. And with that, I'm very happy to take you to our wonderful panel. start with, the first question is for Bruna. To date, do you think that AI has been more beneficial or harmful to the environment? What are the strongest environmental benefits and harms that you've observed?
Hi all. Well, first of all, congratulations for your presentation. I really liked it. It's really full of detail. I think that's very important when we're talking about AI. For just, maybe people don't know, but I work at Hugging Face. Everybody knows Hugging Face here? Yes? Okay. So it's for those who may not know, it's a platform where you can share and download all types of open source models, data sets, everything. A platform where you can collaborate actually in the development of AI. And I think one of the themes that are very important, I think we're going to talk a lot maybe today, is about transparency. So I think open source is one of the possibilities where we can have more data and more transparency over a technology that sometimes can be very opaque and very complex. So, well, I was going to actually say a lot of the things for my primer for this response, so I'm just going to skip that. But the important thing, I think, is when we're thinking about AI, is to think about the whole life cycle that Clara described. So, starting with raw materials to build the GPUs, the compute and everything, the data centers, the concrete that's used in it, the water that's used in the data centers for cooling everything, the energy, then, well, everything that you get from the model training, for the deployment, and then obviously the waste, everything has to be discarded, and we have a lot of problems there too. I think when I read articles and everything, we usually talk a lot about model training. Maybe Alex is going to talk about it because of DeepSeek too. But it's very important that we think about the inference phase, so the deployment phase. We've been seeing a lot of AI applications being used in a lot of things. We see in the US now Google using it for basic search. We use a lot of ChatGPT. I'm sure you all experimented a little bit, at least with AI tools and everything. So the more you deploy, the more energy you are using for it. So it's very important not to stay only in the training phase, but also in the deployment. So just to answer that more directly, the question, I think the discussions over negative and positive impacts on AI is very polarized sometimes. And we see that people sometimes are either very hopeful and very optimistic about the possibilities that AI can give, and the applications that we can develop. And Clara mentioned the few that was going to be more or less the same applications that I was going to see to talk about: climate modeling, smart transportation, energy efficiency, everything. We see the environmental impacts and the social impacts that energy use and water use especially put pressure in the societies where data centers are built and everything. But we also see people saying, well, AI is catastrophic, it's going to be, well, it's going to kill the planet and everything, which, well, it is also helping. But I think it's important to think, when we're talking about AI, about the complexity of things. So there are so many variables that have to be taken into account. There's such a lack in transparency and data over what these companies are doing, how applications are being used. For example, we see Google and Microsoft that had this idea of being net zero, and not being able to do that because of AI use. But also, we don't have access to the information about how much energy they used, also for a competition reason. They don't want to say, well, my data center is more effective than yours, more efficient. So there's a lot of things that we don't have access to in terms of data, because and I think my colleagues are going to talk about the law there, but not always it's mandatory for you to actually disclose all of the data that you have. But also, and I think that goes to Clara's point too, AI is not just one thing. So when we're talking about negative and positive impacts, it's important that we don't talk about AI as if it were the same thing. There are different energy uses and different environmental impacts depending on which AI you're using. So my colleague Sasha Lucioni, and I invite you all to know her work, she did a lot of a lot of calculations, a lot of things that she developed in her research to see that actually large language models, so ChatGPT and stuff that we use, is actually much more intensive in terms of energy use than other applications that are more useful for climate change. So you have climate modeling and smart transportation, sustainable agriculture, all of these applications that are not necessarily generative AI use less energy. So it's not like it's kind of a false narrative that we're talking about positive and negative harm consequences for AI when we're talking about AI in general. So we have to think about these different applications and how actually they have consequences.
Thank you, that was great. And you mentioned GPUs. Do you mind just quickly defining that?
It's just you see the small semiconductors that we have to use for compute power. It's not like you can just, well, now maybe you can, but you can just use like your your laptop to actually run this AI applications. So you have to have a lot of semiconductors that you just GPUs, called GPUs, in the data centers, so you can, because that's the thing, and I think it's a big thing. AI is not just something in the cloud that's just there. It exists as if it were nothing. There's a whole infrastructure with GPUs, with hardware, with cables, with internet, with energy that's necessary for AI to actually be used.
Thank you, because I'm seeing with DeepSeek articles all over, they mention GPUs a lot. They don't define it, so thank you. The next question is for Alex and Mika. When advising clients, do you encounter significant overlaps or tensions between fostering innovation and addressing sustainability concerns? And how do you approach these challenges, if so?
Sure. Great question, great presentation as well, so thank you. So there is an inherent tension, I think, that exists between innovation, which tends to be very fast-paced. You want to get things done as quickly as possible. You know, the sort of old Facebook adage and various other things of sort of move fast and break things, all of that sort of stuff that we've heard time and time again. And on the other hand, risk management, governance, sustainability, all of the things that are effectively negative about the speed at which you're moving, the recklessness with which you're applying these technologies or delivering or developing these technologies, the potential negative impacts or fallout that's associated with them that comes across. Notwithstanding that those inherent tensions exist, and I'd be very interested in your point on this, Mika, in a second, I actually, from an AI side, see very little conversation about sustainability. I don't think that it's a huge area in people's minds at the point of innovation at the moment. What I see a lot of, I spend a lot of time with executives and senior leadership, and what I see a lot of is demand to maintain pace with the rest of the market, to compete appropriately. We've all seen the blockbuster Netflix fallout. If anyone hasn't, it's well worth going and reading about what happens if you don't innovate quickly enough in a highly competitive environment. And I think those pressures are filtering down through businesses to say, no, we need to move, and we need to move at speed, whatever happens. The rest of the organization, particularly legal functions, risk compliance, functions along those lines, are, from what I can see in organizations of all shapes, sizes, and sectors, grappling to keep pace with that balance of innovation and internal risk management as a whole. And that is simply the safety. You know, you've seen it in the AI summit from last year, right? Safety, security, transparency. That was Biden's executive order. That was the title, right? All of these different aspects that apply to that. They didn't really talk about energy efficiency. They didn't really talk about any of these other aspects that sat alongside it. They talked about what is safety in systems, and that's where we see these applications of ethical principles like accountability, transparency, explainability starting to come through from the OECD into various different laws and regulations from an AI perspective globally. But I think what's been lost in that discussion is the bigger picture. And there's a bigger picture application in this that until about 2 weeks ago, I would say was fairly underserved in a lot of organizations. And that's probably not true for all of them. I think certainly in some developers of AI models and systems, I'm sure it would have been something at the front of minds. I wonder whether that would have been, though, because of legal and regulatory obligations and other various risk management applications, or whether it was from a competition perspective, a pricing perspective, the ability to continue to maintain competitive tension. I know that OpenAI's model GPT-3 model to produce cost about 80 billion. And then if you look at the next nearest model to that at the time, it's about 65 billion. If you look at some of the stuff that's being produced today, 5.6 million apparently is coming out of Open, and all the other various different ones out of China and other countries as well. So we're seeing a lot of thinking starting to come up in the space, but I'm not yet seeing necessarily that filtering through into the practical applications that then allow for that discussion to happen that means that we're seeing it practically applied. There are a couple of exceptions to that, which I'm sure we'll touch on later, things like the new EU AI Act Code of Practice starting to talk about this, and the Cloud Act starting to talk about this in Europe, and various others as well. So it is filtering through, but it's filtering through much further behind the rest of the discussion around risks associated with AI. I think it was fairly absent from discourse over the last year to 2 years when you talked about risks. That's my view. Mika's going to tell me I'm completely wrong because she hears it from a sustainability side, and maybe that's coming completely differently for you.
Yeah, so I'm the Debbie Downer climate change lawyer. All I see is risk. I'm literally paid to tell people about risk. That is my salary, the direct connotation between money coming into my bank account. It is literally risk. That said, slightly more reflective on this, your question was about concerns, and I'd like to just sort of openly ask the question, whose concerns are we talking about? Usually when you think about concerns, you're thinking about vulnerable people, you're thinking about the community, you're thinking about potentially silent stakeholders like nature and the environment. One type of concern that we often don't think about is the financial concern on the companies themselves. That's a really important thing to think about. If you have a data center in California that is in a wildfire zone, there's a direct link between climate change and wildfires. There's a direct link between energy usage and climate change. There's a direct link between wildfires and data centers burning. That creates a direct link between your contribution to climate change and a concern for yourself. So when we talk about sustainability from a climate change law perspective, we're really trying to talk about survival. Sustainability is survival. And we're seeing more and more regulatory change at the moment, which is pushing companies to think in that term, to think about your transition planning, your future planning. There's a requirement in the UK at the moment to publish transition plans and climate future proofing. All of that is a way to say it's not about don't innovate, don't progress, but progress in a way that is keeping in mind your future, keeping in mind your sustainability, and ultimately your survival and how you sort of adapt in this world where the future is uncertain. So,
great, thank you. This next question is for all of you. From your experience, how have businesses, the industry, and regulators balanced the competing needs of innovation and environmental protection? And what progress have you seen, and where do challenges remain? Should we start with Bruna?
Yes. Well, hopefully the AI summit next week will talk more about environment. I think so. They have like 5 main themes, one of which is environment. So hopefully we'll see more of that discussion now. But, and I think some of what my colleagues talked about is in response always also to this question. I think it's a work in progress. When we have sometimes difficulty in the political will for things to change, and difficulties regarding the market incentives that we have. So, as Alex was saying, not necessarily transitioning to something more green, or not. It's not like if you use more energy-friendly or environmental-friendly technologies, you're going to get as much profit as you were if you were not to use it. So I think this is really one of the things that are more difficult, is to make that you have enough incentives or enough obligations that companies have to actually comply with, so that we have more development in this phase. And I think one of the things that are really important in the AI ecosystem, at least, is one thing that we don't talk so much, is that sometimes when we have something that's more efficient, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is going to be less use of. So we saw that that's called the Jevons paradox. Maybe you've heard in the last 2 weeks. So it's not AI can be more efficient in terms of energy, in terms of environment and everything, but that doesn't mean that we're going to use the same. It may mean that we are actually using more of it. So it's complicated when you just don't have like this, the sum or the addition. When you get like you have more usage, so you're going to have more environmental costs as well. And that's what we were talking about before in the deployment phase, and using applications in every possible product that we have. So that this is, I think, a challenge, a big challenge in this sphere.
I think thinking of it, from a regulatory perspective, I think regulation is a responsive beast. In most cases, regulation adapts when it sees a problem, and unfortunately, often that, comes slowly. An example outside of AI is PFAS, these chemicals that are used in plastic. That's an example of something that was very innovative and very zippy. It enabled a lot of progress in medical fields, but now it's being seen as something that is environmentally detrimental. People who live next to factories where PFASs are used are finding health impacts, and regulation is then like stepping in to start controlling that. And often that is the case with regulation. I don't think regulators are ever trying to curtail innovation. At least you might disagree.
No,
I don't think any regulators want to, before any progress happens, sort of immediately put their foot in. The unfortunate reality is that they do step in often after a crisis, and they're then criticized for acting too slowly after people have had health impacts or environmental damage. And I think that really is the you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't problem for regulators there. But keen to hear what you think about industry on that.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good point on regulators. And one thing I've been saying for the last few years is that actually right-sized regulation is not an inhibitor for innovation, right? It's actually supportive of innovation in many senses, but it's about getting right-sized regulation and how you go about that process of doing it. And to your point, when's the right time for putting in the regulation? What happens? And I think an interesting point on this is sort of more generally looking at the EU at the moment. There's a lot of dialogue, discourse around whether they move too quickly with their EU Act regulation. Again, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Maybe if they waited longer, they would have seen more instances of what they consider to be prohibited or unacceptable risk activities being carried out in the market. There are certainly some high-profile ones. Things like Clearview AI and various other providers like that, which they've been notoriously up against for some time. But equally, it provides a degree of certainty to the market. It provides clarity for operators that are looking to operate in that market. That provides confidence. And in turn, in theory at least, that should promote innovation rather than hinder it. So I think it's an excellent point that's made in relation to that piece. I think what's interesting about the way that we see the interaction between different stakeholders at the moment, I think about this in the context of previous emerging technologies and the way that dialogue occurs from here onwards, actually. It's only very recent dialogue, as I said earlier, that started up in AI and the environment, I think, within Europe particularly, increasingly so in the UK. But I also think about like blockchain technology, when the discourse started around the energy intensivity of blockchain technology, and particularly proof of work systems. And there was this big uproar, and regulators, whilst they were drafting MiCA, the markets and crypto asset regulation, effectively said, look, we're going to pull in all of this energy efficiency stuff underneath the regulation. They went out, and industry went absolutely mad. And they said, you're overreaching, you can't be going in that far, that's too much. So they rode back. And suddenly a lot of that forced sustainability, forced perspective on energy efficiency, all of those pieces were suddenly taken back out again, because that was perceived at the time to be inhibiting innovation in that space. Well, lo and behold, you look at the EU Act Code of Practice that comes out, right? EU Act Code of Practice comes out, they expand the energy efficiency requirements to require energy consumption disclosures for general purpose artificial intelligence systems, so developers of the largest AI models for all intent and purpose, right? A point made on inference earlier, which was fantastic, a huge amount of energy consumed in that sort of space, that now this obligation will, at least as drafted in the draft, encompasses training and inference and maintenance. So that's much wider than it was before. Lo and behold, what's happened in this situation? No one's jumping up and down and saying, this is fantastic, wonderful thing to put in there. Big tech's now jumping up and down and saying, hang on a second, you're overreaching. You're going way further than the draft initially allowed you to go, right? You're going way further into the world of energy efficiency than you should be doing. You're also forming, by the way, this is quite an interesting new developing point, we're also forming groups of people to get feedback on these drafts that are much wider than we'd anticipated and probably don't have solid views, at least in the perspective of tech companies, that should be commenting on these things. Well, hang on a second then, what's going to happen to that provision? Is that now going to be watered down as a result of this uproar in the same way we saw it with previous emerging technology uproars? How much are the regulators going to stand behind what they're saying in this space? I think that's where I'm going to see the really interesting piece, which is why I think we're at this inflection point now for AI and environment. I think this is a really new thing, as I said in the very first answer I had, that's really coming to the boil, I think, right now. And you made an excellent point about France hosting the AI summit, right? Last time around, Bletchley Declaration, well, time before technically, but the Bletchley Declaration, it was all about safety, it was all about security. We're now switching that dialogue over. And I think that's naturally going to be the case because A, France need to do something differently to everybody else. There's no point having another safety summit, frankly. B, you've got all of this dialogue on the EU AI Act coming through that talks about this sort of stuff. So are we going to see a second type of Bletchley Declaration, right? Something that now focuses on the entities that are going to be there, countries that are going to be there, joining together and saying, actually, you know what, we're going to stand behind this, we're going to commit to this? Or are we just going to see yet more discussion, yet more discourse in this space that then ultimately leads to regulators rowing back and therefore not very much actually happening in practice? I think that's going to be the interesting piece. All questions, no answers. I'm sorry, Clara.
No, that's still brilliant. Thank you. The next question is for Mika. Are there any current or proposed regulations addressing AI's impact on the environment? Where do you see gaps or opportunities for improvement?
Great. Well, welcome everybody to environmental law. So I guess before we go into the specific law, just taking it back to very basic principles. Clara, your really good presentation mentioned a lot of the problems that we're seeing from AI, namely from the impact of data centers. I'd kind of break it down into life cycle, sort of birth, life, death of data center and where each of those have impacts and where each of those is addressed by the law. Your birth of a data center, it's before the data center is even built, factoring in energy and water impacts on the local community and factoring that into the approval process. Your life of a data center, you're looking at once the data center is in situ, controlling how much resource usage it's using. So either reducing the energy and water consumption or where that's not possible, channeling that towards renewable or sustainable resource use. And then your death of the data center, you're looking at like waste management and a managed decommissioning. The very unsexy answer is that a lot of these are actually covered by existing regulations, which people don't necessarily think about because they're not very buzzy or exciting. For example, your birth of a data center, the UK is rife with planning regulations. If anybody reads the news, especially more on, let's say, the Telegraph side of it, or it will be lots of complaints about all these planning regulations that require you to consider lots of types of bats and et cetera. Those actually exist for a real legitimate purpose, which is to manage the impacts of a new installation on the communities that exist nearby it. A really interesting development that we're seeing is more of those regulations being used to consider not just the kind of immediate impacts, but also the greenhouse gas impacts of an installation in the long term. A very notable recent case was Crown against Finch, which was actually a gas plant. And it was found that the planning process should have actually considered over the life cycle of that gas processing plant, the greenhouse gas emissions that were released by that. Nobody really pays attention. Again, planning law, remarkably unsexy, but very important. Next important one is, your life cycle. Again, the UK has a lot of regulation around energy usage. You can do that either one of two ways. You can have either a hard law requirement that says don't use too much energy, Or what's actually more common is what I call the kind of name and shame approach to regulation, which is not preventing you from doing it, but requiring you to disclose publicly and in a way shaming you, shaming might not be the PC word, but sort of through public disclosure, encouraging you to be more mindful of your impacts. Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which applies to all large companies in the UK, is a very big example of that. Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU, the SEC rules in the US, basically every country sort of quietly, without people knowing, not in a very sexy way, through the sort of back door of corporate legislation, has implemented these things that slowly, incrementally encourage companies to be more mindful of their energy footprints. And through that, you see AI companies entering into these private agreements with renewable companies where they basically agree bilaterally, again, behind closed doors, to supply their energy usage with renewable power on the basis of, not then disclosing that they're powering their data centers through oil and gas. The death, again, incredibly unsexy, the waste packaging rules and waste management. Of course, there are lots of buzzy new pieces of regulation, Europe's Artificial Intelligence Act, the Cloud and AI Act. However, those actually don't really talk about energy that much. They sort of talk about it in passing, but it's not really the focus of it. One that we saw in the US, the Artificial Intelligence Environmental Act, a bill was passed, probably will be tabled, considering sort of the environment with Trump. But yeah, worth not forgetting just the existing framework. I think one place that it could be going a bit further, and this is my one sort of like what could be better, there are all these existing regulations. They don't necessarily always help the people who live right next to data centers. These are really, high usage, what would you call them? High usage areas. Lots of communities that are protesting new data centers being built. One thing that we're seeing that's quite interesting in the case of oil and gas is oil and gas majors being required to contribute to the remediation of the environmental impacts in the communities surrounding them. We're seeing that in the US, for example. There's a host of these so-called like polluter pay funds. That could be something that you could see in AI, requiring sort of AIs to contribute to a fund in local communities to help not so much pay the immediate impacts of that data center, but invest money into the local fire service to help bolster sort of wildfire preparedness, or invest money into water management resources. So not sort of the immediate impacts, but those like impacts down the line. Again, that's something we're seeing in the oil and gas space. TBC if it's something that could apply in the AI/data center space. Not something we're seeing currently, so that's just my kind of 2 cents of potentially something interesting to look out for in the future.
Incredible, thank you. And that is a good example of why I didn't attempt to touch on the law aspect of my presentation. I couldn't have done that. You structured that so well, so thank you. The next question is for Alex. What key legal considerations should businesses focus on when adopting AI technologies, especially regarding sustainability?
Thank you. Very tricky one, frankly, at this point in time, because there's so little realistically to go off. So data center world, I'm going to put to one side because I think that was brilliantly explained, and I think is covered off, right? There is regulation that will flow through into contracts. You should be expecting to make sure that that's been put into action. The bit that I'm particularly interested in is the interrelation between developers and deployers of models and systems, and sort of what's coming through there, right? Transparency was mentioned brilliantly earlier, I thought, and transparency is sort of the name of the game in this, and I think this is where we're starting to see some challenges, but also, again, right-sized transparency obligations being put in. The challenge, so the EU AI Act, for example, or any other AI regulation is interesting because it's not like the general data protection regulations where you just had a batch of clauses that you would just stick into every single one of your contract and you were done. What we've really got are different risk classifications that are coming through, right? different areas of risk, not just from a legal perspective, but from your business perspective, from a technological perspective, from sustainability perspective, high impact, low impact. And I thought it was a point excellently made earlier that not all AI is equal. Your explanations at the beginning, particularly on the different types of artificial intelligence, even within that, right? We're really talking about, and it's why it's time and time again the one that's mentioned by the Labour government and various others, we're really talking about those developers of the largest models, right? And what does it mean to be energy efficient in that context, more than it does with the smaller models or the green models that you mentioned brilliantly as well. The EU AI Act's Code of Practice does touch very lightly, exactly as Mika said earlier, on energy efficiency requirements. And the main thing there, as I said, was around energy consumption disclosures for GPA AI models, general purpose artificial intelligence models, or the largest generative artificial intelligence models. So those providers of models having to disclose what their energy consumption actually looks like. And I think that transparency piece is a really interesting one, right? Because that's the challenge I think we have with this. You can't mitigate the risk. You can't mitigate issues that are coming through if you don't know what the risk or the actual size of the problem is, right? So there's a piece there for that. The challenge is, without substantive regulation putting that in place, there's a lot of weight on the side of the GPIA model providers, right? They have produced these phenomenal pieces of technology, right, which are brilliant and people want to get access to. Back to the innovation question at the beginning, how do organizations stay ahead of their competitors? They use the best technology to do so. And so if the producers of the best technology are the ones that have the largest models, that have been the most labor intensive to train, that have used the most energy to train, that perhaps aren't the most efficient in the market at the moment for whatever reason, and there is no obligation in law or regulation to say you must disclose your energy consumption, I can tell you now, I don't think there's going to be that many of them that are willing to negotiate into their contracts that they're going to voluntarily do so. I've not seen it starting to be incorporated either into contract or into the technology itself, even technologies being able to sort of say, well, actually, what's the load on the system? What are we actually using here? So there'll be an interesting piece here which says, actually, the EU Act's already started to usher in new clauses into contracts that try to mitigate some of these risks that are arising. If this piece doesn't get watered down, I think we might start to see more of that leaning through. The challenge with that, though, of course, is around the interrelation between AI regulation and existing sustainability regulation, other regulations. What we haven't got, even if we had that clause, right, is a series of harmonized methodologies for measuring energy use in those contexts. So we would also need to see the methodologies. We would also need to see shared standards. You know, there's a whole waterfall of things that will have to start to come through to make these obligations practically workable, as well as, you know, what they're worth on a piece of paper. I do think more broadly, we're seeing things like incident reporting that comes out of the other side of it as well. So, you know, again, it comes back to what's in the regulation. If you look at the EU Act, there's a whole incident reporting frameworks. If anything breaches the Act, that will have to come through. As a user of those services, you would probably want to be notified by the provider or the deployer of the service that that breach has happened, that incident has had to happen, if it's sustainability related. But again, if there is nothing in the regulation that bites on that, there is no mandatory requirement to notify the incident to the authorities. There is nothing that's going to flow back again through. So there's a question here. We see it with cloud computing still all the time, right, as a more general perspective, which is, you know, the amount of leverage that parties have when they're negotiating these arrangements and the amount of power that a smaller group of technology vendors ultimately have in the grand scheme of things. And from a competition perspective, you know, not suggesting in any capacity that this is an anti-competitive move, but they're certainly not going to be willing to move in concert. You know, there's going to be a unified, balance against that. So the practical reality is that there's not really a great deal beyond what we've got at the moment in existing regulation, from my perspective, that we can use in absence of something more specific coming through, if we think that's necessary. But again, I think the point here is it necessary that that is there for everybody, or should that be a targeted piece of regulation that really only applies to a very small group of organizations and bites only in certain limited circumstances? You mentioned DeepSeek earlier. I think about that in the context of distillation and what's coming out at the moment, for example. the amount of energy that's used, 10 to 40 times less energy being used, very small, chips that avoid embargoes for all intent and purpose that are being used for this, right? That's really interesting as a potential route for innovation. If you're using that little energy, even as a GPA model developer, you probably shouldn't be caught by any of these regulations or any of these aspects, or should you? It's an open question sort of back to the room, like what level, if you have lots of little models all contributing to sustainability issues, that's equally as bad as a few large ones doing the same thing, isn't it? I don't know, maybe not. It's a difficult call to make, but from a legal and regulatory perspective, actually very difficult practically to implement some of those pieces.
Thank you. That was interesting, and I hadn't thought of that aspect before. The next question is for Bruna. Do you think it's possible to achieve net zero without leveraging AI tools? And what role do you see for AI in this journey? That's just a brief one. And then I wanted to ask all of you, what role do you see for lawyers in this journey?
Well, I think the net zero question is more of a question for scientists, people who are developing the technologies. But what I would say would be that we should use everything that we can to achieve net zero, everything that we can to actually face this crisis. And if AI can help, of course, that should be used. But as we've been saying since the beginning, AI is very complex and it involves a lot of things. So we have to take into account the whole life cycle, but all the uses, also the socioeconomic aspects of it. So it's not that easy. And as Alex was, and my colleagues were putting also, is the transparency over the data and the standards over how you measure the data, the methodologies, everything has to be taken into account for you to actually have something or the possibility of making a decision that's more informed. As we are now, of course, we're not at nothing, but we're lacking a lot of information to actually be able to use it.
I think just what role do you think lawyers have in this whole journey? Because we are talking to a group of a lot of junior lawyers or people in the legal profession.
Yeah, of course. Well, exciting. We run a lot of climate change training for lawyers at this firm, so keen to spread the message. Obviously, from the climate side, a question I often get asked as a climate change lawyer in a corporate law firm is, are you helping large corporations evade or avoid their climate obligations? And the answer is no. In fact, we're empowering them to understand them better and comply better. Is very difficult to comply with an obligation that you don't understand, that you need help navigating. And I think that's a really important thing for lawyers to do, is to continue to hold their clients accountable and continue to help them make better choices. And on that note, sort of opening up to the floor and to junior lawyers, one thing that we always say when we do this climate change training to junior lawyers is, as a lawyer, you are in a very privileged position. You are a fiduciary. You're a voice in the room that is trusted. And we really do try to encourage people to put that climate change advice sort of high up on the agenda and keep reminding clients that this is important. This is a risk that they face. In my own experience, one piece of advice that we gave, we were doing a due diligence report, and among various other risks, we flagged some climate change regulation. We put it on page 3, and the client came back and said, actually, can you move it up to page 1, because we value this advice and we think optically the fact that it's coming from your law firm and coming on page 1 of your key issues list really sort of highlights the importance to us. And I like to put that back to the room, if this is an issue that is important for you, sort of considering how you can carry it forward in your professional lives.
I definitely shouldn't go after you. I mean, that was excellent. I have very little of value to add to any of that, right? I think I completely agree with everything that's being said on this, right? I think there is an aspect here about you are lawyers, you are in a privileged position, you're in a trusted position with clients. So I think about this as an AI lawyer and sitting on that side of the fence, where I'm often involved in conversations around innovation and how we can move as quickly as we can and all of those sorts of things. And I think it's making sure that those thoughts are on the table, that balance is in the room. Why hasn't it been on the list of risks for the last year and a half? Why haven't we been discussing this. I'm as guilty of that, I think, as anybody else is, right? I certainly wasn't raising it as a risk 18 months ago and saying, hang on a second, that should be in the mix alongside all of this wider risk management we're thinking about. And actually, how are we making sure that these two things move in line with each other? And that what we're talking about isn't innovation at all costs. It's innovation in a way that's responsible, innovation in a way that's secure and safe, but also environmentally and sustainably, or environmentally friendly and sustainable in that sense. And I think that's going to be a really important thing. I would also keep in mind the importance of challenging your own thinking, but also your clients' thinking more broadly, and the narratives that sit around things, and not just taking as read what is being sort of fed to you in a lot of these situations. There are certainly a lot of very good marketing spin that sits around the positive aspects, I think, associated with the number of tools and solutions coming out. But a point about being a lawyer is sort of really recognizing the full spectrum of risk and balancing that risk. There is a really important piece that I think about, the DeepSeek piece that you mentioned earlier, in the aspect of distillation, and the question over actually at what cost or how, frankly, practically, is it achieving the level of capability that it is, whilst not utilizing as much energy or utilizing the same processing powers and various other things, right? And there's an open question that's going on in the market. I'm sure we'll see it starting to trundle through the courts ever so soon, which is around the role of distillation, around the role of, saying that this is going to be the game-changing innovation of the future, this is going to change how things work. Algorithmic optimization absolutely is a brilliant thing and will contribute significantly to this. But at what cost? Is that model effectively ripping off somebody else's work? Is that model for infringing intellectual property rights of another organization? Is that model leveraging data that it shouldn't be leveraging from organizations where it shouldn't be leveraging, trade secret or otherwise? There's a lot of question marks that open up to actually what are these sort of sustainable practices in many senses that go around. And I think the point is that as a lawyer, you've got to be there to be critical. You've got to be there to properly kick the tires on these things and actually to have your own thought yourself and say, well, hang on a second, is this as it seems, or is there something more for me to be saying here? I'm also not advocating either way on the DeepSeek situation, so I'll just say that now.
And if I can complement, maybe just with the sheer amount of pressure that we see from these marketing stunts and from also in the AI sphere, the geopolitics of the thing, it's not easy to navigate. I think as lawyers, as Mika was saying brilliantly before, it's important that we can actually get down to earth and see the risks and see what's actually happening and see the consequences of what we are talking about. So when we're in the middle of a policy discussion that's just talking about US dominance or China dominance, the China-US war race on AI and everything, sometimes things that are very practical, that are very important, very, very consequential, are lost in the discussion. So I think as lawyers, you have this very, very great capacity and also the power, as you were saying, with our words to actually bring down a conversation and drive it to wherever you think it's best in that position. And just to tell you, these meetings that Alex was talking about on the code of practice for the EU AI Act, they are very, very long. There are many. And we see the policy people, also the lawyers, with very good arguments, either way. So as we were saying, we have to be very critical and very capable of seeing what people are saying, in between the lines. And I think we, as lawyers, are very prepared to do that. At least we have the tools, the mental tools for that.
Thank you. I love the idea of lawyers being really powerful and shaping things in not manipulative ways, but shaping it how you think should be the right way, in a legal way. The next question is for Bruno, but please, both of you chip in if you have something to say on this as well. But I mentioned this a bit in my talk. It's, do you see an uneven regional distribution of AI's environmental impacts? Are there parallels with historical patterns of economic exploitation and inequality?
So I would say yes, but I would really be willing to hear your thoughts too. I think Well, from the life cycle that we were talking about before, there is the raw materials extraction, minerals, and everything that we see, depending on whether these minerals are more rare. Sometimes you have conflicts, sometimes you have war, you have a lot of waste in the mining, you have a lot of electronic waste that is disproportionately sent to the global south. So of course we can see that very directly in the AI sphere. But also I think since we're talking about AI that needs such a large infrastructure, we were talking about cables, cloud, hardware, there are so many things there. There are not only models that we're talking about when we're talking about AI. And this is very concentrated, as has been richness and like resources in general from what we see. So if we think about semiconductors, if we think with chips, NVIDIA has so much of the market and it's very controlled in the US. Also cables, well, we are seeing not only that the resources are very concentrated over very few companies, but that these companies are also in very few countries, where we see like the historically have been so much more privileged. And we see, I really wanted to read that before we come here, before I came here, but I saw that there's this fellow from LSE that just published a book that's called Techno-Colonialism, and do you know it? People have read it? So yeah, she's trying to explore, I think, the history of colonialism and how it intersects with technologies and how data and how AI, for example, is being used in humanitarian and refugee camps to see how this actually can perpetuate power relations and that have been there since, well, a very long time.
Yeah, I think it's actually really interesting because when we think of AI, obviously as a problem and the inequalities that data centers cause, et cetera. But even when we think of AI as a solution, a really important question is solution for whom? Whose solution are we talking about? And I'm not a technology person, but my understanding, thanks to your very good explanation for dummies of how AI works, is that it relies on existing know-how that has been created. It sort of digests and distills this. But whose know-how, whose information are we digesting and distilling? A lot of the internet comes from developed countries. A lot of the input into the AI is coming from developed industrial countries. So is the solution that AI outputting, is it something that is actually benefiting everybody, or is it a solution that is benefiting just the people who have fed in the underlying data to the model? And I know we've talked about it as the sort of black box of AI and the fact that it's really difficult to know where AI is drawing its knowledge from. But I'd just like to leave it on the point as a climate change lawyer. The UN talks a lot about this concept of just transition. There's no transition without a just transition. And it's really important when you're thinking about climate solutions to also think about whether these compound existing inequalities that are made worse by climate change. And again, a question without a solution, but does AI potentially make those inequalities worse?
It's a fantastic point. I completely agree with both of my colleagues on the panel. One thing that's sort of emerging, I think, at the moment in terms of dialogue among policymakers, particularly in Europe, that I wonder whether will have an impact, particularly on the tech colonialism piece that you were mentioning, is around the sort of counterfactual of tech sovereignty and this increasing desire not to be reliant on third-party nations, basically. There's an increasing push, particularly within Europe, to centralize a lot of the power or all capabilities, in fact, data center capabilities particularly, and start to relocate those, for all intent and purpose, within the tech sovereignty sort of Europe itself. The UK's actually said a similar thing. I don't think we've said it in quite as many ways, but if you look at the AI action plan, we're talking about the Energy Council being set up. I mean, there wasn't anything particularly substantive in there, but they did talk about renewables. They talked about small modular reactors. They talked about, these zones, the 5 zones that are being set up. That's a really interesting piece. When you put those pieces of the puzzle together, what they're sort of saying is actually, can we be locating these data centers in locations that historically we wouldn't have otherwise been doing that? Does that mean, therefore, that actually what we're going to see over the next few years is this drive for tech sovereignty is going to move us away from this over-expansive policy of going into nations that are scarce on resources and other things and placing our data centers or placing other pieces there? Open question. I have no idea whether that's going to play out or whether that's not, but I can certainly see tech sovereignty bubbling up in a lot of the discussions at the moment. And I think that question of what is the practical reality that's going to play out as a result of that, and how does that interact with the tech colonialism aspect is going to be a really fascinating one to see play through. So yeah, more questions and answers again.
No, thank you. Oh my gosh, yeah.
I know that we've had a few questions coming in on the Slido, and I'm sure that the audience in the room have got some.
Thank you. I was sorry, I lost track of time. I actually forgot you were here. I was having a good time here. So yes, it's time for the Q&A. Thank you guys so much. Can we just round of applause for these panelists? Yeah. Should we start with online, if there's some questions that have come through? Thank you.
Hello? Okay, sorry, I'm just loading the online question quickly. Okay, so our top voted question from our online audience is, do the panelists think that AI has the potential to contribute to or mitigate mis- and disinformation, presumably in the climate space, but maybe elsewhere as well? Interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
It's a really difficult. It's funny that I'm the first one to answer and I'm not the tech person at all. But, like, my own fear about AI is that sometimes it can amplify a wrong answer. I remember when ChatGPT was first released, a friend told me, you're going to be out of a job. And at first I was really angry. But then I thought, oh, this could be great. I'm very lazy as a person. So potentially it'd be great if I could just like be out of a job. So I asked it a legal question and it gave me the wrong answer. And I was really disappointed because I had to then do the work myself. And the moral of the story is AI is not always right. We see all sorts of things about how AI amplifies parts of the discourse that are wrong, specifically in the climate space, and not necessarily just on the AI, but there is so much climate disinformation that fuels a lot of political unrest. For example, just thinking about the wildfires in AI, I've seen news articles that there have been Russian bots that have sort of blasted X by saying that one of the reasons why the US didn't have the resources to fight the wildfires was because it was overinvesting armaments in Ukraine, how there would be a link unknown, but there was a real sort of like bombardment of X of that type of disinformation, and it was sort of utilizing a climate catastrophe to serve a nefarious political purpose. I'll leave it to the tech experts on how you sort of foster reliability and accuracy with AI.
No, I think that's called when we're prompting something on the maybe no, but when you're prompting something, you get like a wrong answer or something completely bizarre from a chatbot or something. That's called hallucination, because actually the way the technologies are working right now, they don't have necessarily neither the capability nor the guardrails or the energy to energy. I mean, like political and commercial energy to actually make the response exactly true. So it will just it will just give you an answer that's statistically what the words have been put together. So it's not the ChatGPT or any chatbot has, at least for now, the legal obligation to give a true answer. But also and I think that's one of the things. Not only the AI is used this way, and people tend to rely very much even if they know that a chatbot can hallucinate, we tend to rely and trust the answer that the technology is giving us, which is a problem. But so we are using the chatbots to actually write these articles, but we are using also AI in the algorithm in the algorithms of the distribution channels that we have. So it's not like you write an article and maybe it will never be read. But if you write an article and you put it in a social platform and then it's distributed like, well, we've all seen that. We've all lived through that. When you receive the same message or the same message but in multiple formats many times, of course, the consequences are very great. And AI is in the middle of these algorithm distribution channels. So this is very important too, because it's not only the making of the information, but I think also the technology can be built to actually find out and fact check and see, contain a little bit of that information too, I think, if you can.
Completely agree. I think that excellent points from both of my colleagues on the panel. There's a few things that kind of strike me on the misinformation, disinformation argument. I think the first is that these systems are only as good as the data that is put into them in the first place. The data they're trained on, the instruction data, various other things, right? So at the end of the day, what's being done in the process of testing those systems, putting those systems together, checking the data to ensure that bias isn't imported. Of course, there is inherent risk that you'll end up with misinformation or disinformation as a result of inherent bias within systems, conscious or unconscious, right? Or unconscious or conscious bias in the coding of the technology itself, right? There's a number of different points where that sort of thing can come in and skew the output. And if you don't have, and it's actually one of the reasons the EU IAT has various things, transparency obligations for one, but also testing requirements in there as well, saying actually what are you doing to mitigate the risk that's being inherited into this through the data that's being put through, and then perpetuated, as you rightly said at the very beginning, by the feedback loop that's within machine learning or deep learning systems, right, and continually refined on. The point of hallucination or confabulation is an excellent one. You see that in the NIST AI RMF, the risk management framework that's used by a lot of companies, or ISO 42001. It's inherently a problem that you see within generative artificial intelligence systems, because by their nature they are predictive systems. They are predicting a series of words based on the training data that they have historically been provided, right? It's created a bunch of different connections, and it's therefore predicting larger complex technology, proses of text than we've historically been able to do, but it's still predictive. And so there is still the probability within there, no matter what you do, that it will hallucinate. And every test that we've done on legal systems, every test that I've seen done anywhere, will still show that put enough data in, put enough prompts in, it will come out at some point in time with some form of hallucination or some form of confabulation. It's why we have grounding, it's why we have all of these various different things to minimize that risk, but that still doesn't necessarily negate the entirety of that, right? Human in loop continues to be a good, so I'm sorry, you're not going to get to retire, I don't think, anytime soon. I think it's still going to be a really important piece to sit over the top of that and ensure it's not there. And I also think too, I mean, we saw it in the news over the weekend, didn't we? But deepfakes are a really good example of where really this issue can be. Do you even know? Yeah, we talked about it a bit, actually. You said it wasn't going to be necessarily connected to the session, but it kind of is now, right? That image, we didn't know which one was, or most of us didn't know which one was made by an artificial intelligence system and which one was made by a human. And we see that all the time. We've seen Donald Trump being arrested by the FBI in various different things, right? We've seen lots of misinformation in relation to Ukraine, for example, that's being spread by bots and various other things as well. And it's true for many things. One of the biggest cybersecurity issues of last year was caused by a deepfake, extraordinarily sophisticated deepfake system that used multiple video deepfakes to be able to effectively convince somebody to transfer tens and tens and tens of millions of pounds from their organization to them. It stops you from being able to know what you can trust online. And I think that's a really interesting piece of where do we go in the future. It's an ESG question in the more societal standpoint, right? But that question of saying, how do we mitigate this challenge? Yes, you can slap obligations down that say, you must be transparent, you must tell people that you're using artificial intelligence, but nefarious actors tend not to care so much. So there's a big question mark there. But I thought your point was excellent in that we so often, probably as lawyers, we do this a bit too much. We so often talk about the risks. We so often talk about the downsides and challenges. If you look at artificial intelligence use at the moment, social media sites, exactly as you say, use it for screening of misinformation. They use it for screening of content more generally, content that none of us want to see, right? Those are positive aspects of the same systems that we're talking about creating these other images. I saw a brilliant thing the other day, and I can't remember which. It might be O2 maybe that's doing it, but I'm not sure, so don't hold me to that. But scammers on telephones that waste people's time, take all their money and everything else. How do you stop them from doing that? There's been, for a long time, you've got groups of people that will sit on and try and keep the scammers on the phone for as long as possible. If they're on the phone to somebody who knows they're a scammer, they're going to not be on the phone to someone who doesn't, and therefore less likely to be able to drain money from people's accounts for all intent and purpose. Artificial intelligence systems, generative artificial intelligence combining audio, text-to-speech capability and other things have been used and now are starting to be deployed exactly for that purpose. You don't need thousands of individuals to be sat there stopping the scammers. You can get one artificial intelligence system, generative AI, pretending to be an old lady, as O2 has, that then is on the phone. And it's fantastic. If anyone's not seen the video, please go and watch it afterwards, because it is excellent. It's extremely convincing. That is using this technology for good. So I think, there are two sides to the misinformation, disinformation piece. Actually, sometimes that can be powerful for us.
I think just to go back to the open source thing, I think it's important for us to actually focus on maybe just see the importance of having these systems open source and having more information over how they work, because actually when it is open source and we get access to things, we can see and check where the bias is, where the data has been coming from. So it's easier for us to actually manage whatever risks or whatever consequences we're having with the technology.
Thank you. Do we have time for maybe one more question from the audience? Or?
Yeah, of course. Does anyone have a question?
So in terms of the way you framed it about climate risk, Mika, and how that's making it rise up the agenda for companies, what we didn't discuss was nature-related risk. And I think in Clara, when you listed all the different types of impacts, there were a lot of nature-related ones. And in terms of transition risk, I wonder whether it could get moved up the agenda faster, because nature-related risk is so different in terms of, one, there's double materiality coming through with the TNFD and the EU regulations, but also the types of litigation that you're seeing with nature-related risk. You can make that physical link between the place of the impact, possibly in the global south, through the supply chains or through a headquarter being somewhere else, and then the litigation can be brought here, and it's easier to prove because they're more tangible impacts. So I wonder whether that could accelerate if those nature-related cases are brought, or whether those people start disclosing under TNFD and they have to disclose about water, whether it could move it up the agenda faster for AI. Could you see that happening?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think it's something that's often overlooked. People think about climate but don't necessarily think about nature. Key illustration is the fact that there's, COP, the big UN conference for climate, is attended by 80,000 people. There's a separate one for nature, happens half less as often and is attended by half the amount of people. So you're entirely right, and I think it's really important, to talk about nature alongside climate. The flip side of that is that nature is a lot more complicated. TNFD as a framework is quite obtuse as somebody who has to use it sort of often. It's very complicated. Climate, not that climate is easy, but it's very easily quantifiable. You're talking about carbon or carbon equivalent, which is measurable and trackable over time. With nature, you're talking about things that are different for every locality. You're talking about things that you have to map. What can be a nature impact in the Amazonian forest won't be the same nature impact as central London. So it's a much less linear process. I think, just as a broader point, very important to bear in mind, also very important to bear in mind that things like core environmental law, pollution, water usage, again, going back to the point that I made much earlier, that these are sort of the bread and butter, very unsexy, but very kind of the day in the life of a law firm type things that really don't get like valued enough and recognized enough. So yeah, basic point, I think you're absolutely right. It needs to stay on the agenda. However, it's very complex and it takes people who are enthusiastic and, you know, have the energy to promote these things to get to grips to them and bring them on the agenda of clients. So yeah, call to action is understand it and bring it to people's attention.
Thank you.
I think that's probably
Yeah.
it for timing wise, because we've overrun.
Yes. Thank you to those of you who have stayed. That's really impressive. I would have stayed all night, to be honest. This is fun. We should have done a podcast. That would actually, okay, whatever, next time. If you have any more questions, maybe you can come and approach these lovely panelists. But thank you again so much for coming, and thank you. This is such a great panel. Came up with so many ideas I, again, didn't think of, and I'm really grateful to have you here. So
Thank you, Clara.
Thanks for having
Thanks,
us.
Clara.
And just to say a really big thanks to Clara as well for her fantastic presentation. She did a really great job, and for organising this whole session. We have a space booked in All Bar 1, I think, by Liverpool Street Station now. So if anyone would like to join us for a drink after this session, please do come along. But thank you. Thanks for coming.